the whole concept around, or the movement, I guess, behind DEIB, for me personally, up until last year, it was something that I was aware of and understood to some extent the benefits of, but it never really crystallized until I was actually diagnosed with ADHD earlier on this year. Talking to people who were advocates for this and allies, and were involved with movements, it was one thing to be like, "Oh, that's a great idea. I can see the benefit of that," but then very much being put on the flip side of that, and having that kind of be a necessity for me to actually succeed in the workplace, and a kind of eye-opening moment for myself personally, and being like, oh, having a company that is willing and open to hear, it is able to change kind of like my role in a way that kind of works for me personally and makes me feel like I have the opportunity to succeed. I have the resources available to me, and also the support of my manager to be able to come to them with certain questions and requests to kind of like accommodate how my brain works and everything around that. It wasn't something I'd experienced or needed to experience until Stack. So for me, it's, I don't know. I would encourage anyone who's listening to this, even if they don't understand from a personal standpoint, kind of like how beneficial it is, talk to people who do directly benefit from initiatives like this, because it makes a meaningful impact in terms of how they feel within the company.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and thank you for sharing that. It reminds me of two things that I think about when it comes to Stack Overflow's journey and my personal journey too, in terms of thinking about DEIB, which is, when I first joined Stack Overflow 9 years ago, we didn't have a lot of DEIB efforts that were there yet. We didn't have folks that were working on this full time. We didn't have sort of affinity groups or employer resource groups that were trying to create a support network for people that held certain identities. That was something that really started with a lot of the sort of like grassroots organizing that individual contributors had, that for people who thought that this was really important, right? And it wasn't and for several years, something that I believe that leadership and the overall company really, one, understood, and therefore I think provided enough support to actually push forward a lot of the things that we thought were really important for DIB. And that's still an ongoing conversation that we're having right now, not just with leadership, but for everybody in the company. Right. And I think that that's never going to stop. It's always going to be a conversation. There's always going to be more that you can improve on this front. But the more that you're able to create more alignment, more education, and especially develop relationships with people that can understand what the experience is like, to your point earlier, that's going to be something that really propels, I think, a lot of those efforts forward, especially internally in an organization. And the second thing that I actually really wanted to mention is, something that you've talked about where it's like, oh, it wasn't until I felt like I had a part of myself that really needed to consider some of the efforts that were already ongoing with DIB. One of the conversations I have a lot with people that are thinking about this is like people with a certain sort of identity or identify in a certain way. Here in America, I hear a lot of like, I am a cis white man who is straight, and I have a 4-year degree program. That's the majority of what I typically see inside of the tech industry, and I don't want to take up space. I want to make sure that the people that are coming from maybe a more underrepresented background really have that. And so they count themselves out of being part of that inclusion work. But I firmly, firmly believe that everybody has a role to play when it comes to pushing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging forward. And in fact, especially folks that identify as part of a group that has a lot of power and a lot of access within their organization and within their broader community, right? If we don't have those folks involved in those conversations, are you going to, one, maybe garner the support of people who are in leadership that might identify in that way a little bit more, make sure that they have an understanding of what the lived experiences are of the people that may be more impacted by some of the DEIB work that's out there, but also, just to be, you may not actually know if somebody may hold a certain identity, right? That sort of like a profile that I talk about that I think most people sort of hold, at least in the United States anyways, about what the sort of like prototypical person who, again, is sort of like a cis, white, male, straight, came from a computer science background. most people aren't exactly that permutation of sort of like characteristics or identities here. So I'd say that the vast majority of people have something about their own lived experiences that can speak to the things that a lot of other folks that are involved with this work can relate to, right? And so those are the two things that I really think about a lot when you sort of bring up that story.
Would you be able to dive into that a little bit deeper in terms of serving, say, for example, the gay community or the queer community here at Stack Overflow and respecting privacy? That balance is quite a tightrope to go through. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about how Stack Overflow actually solved that issue, or kind of their thought process, how you kind of went around balancing that?
Yeah, sure. The short answer is we're still trying to figure it out, right? This is something that I think is personally really important to me, but again, really balancing those different considerations is, I think, is very important, right? Privacy, number one, is something that I think, especially the developer community, is really, really, cares a lot about, because we know sort of like how the sausage is made, behind the scenes, and so we understand that, like, what does a cookie do, and why, when we think about storing PII, what are the considerations that are there, right? So overall, we think of privacy as something that is universally important for all of the people that actually come and use our products overall, right? Thinking about how we can still serve the LGBTQIA community and the queer community overall while still maintaining that privacy is still one of those challenges that we're still looking into. We don't have a great answer for that just yet, right? For example, on Stack Overflow, we have a long history of respecting people who want to stay anonymous on the platform, right? You can sort of post questions, for example, or respond and interact with the platform if you didn't have a registered account. You're not required to use, your actual name on Stack Overflow right now. And so we're revisiting, I'd say, a lot of those different aspects that would allow us to maybe get a little bit more insight as to how we're serving different communities and different identities that people sort of hold. But at the same time, still need to have a balancing act with some of the things that have been important to the community and to, I think, all sort of companies and businesses that are coming up with web platforms like this around something like privacy, right? So stay tuned. I think we're still trying to figure that out.
Last question. Do you have any advice for those who want to educate themselves further on DEIB efforts? And what ways can they go about learning about everything they might need to learn about to be more of an active member in the community?
For folks who want to get more involved in DEIB work, I'd say that the first thing to do is to maybe not necessarily ask somebody who's been involved in this just to sort of like have them brain dump on you, because that can be quite a lot of effort overall. But I think it's important that you start developing the relationships that are really important so that you can, actually get an understanding and start a two-way conversation with those folks that are there, right? I think that's one of the most effective ways that you can start off with, is not necessarily trying to be like, hey, I don't know anything. Can you just give me a class on everything on DEIB, right? But actually get to know those people. Again, I think one of the most powerful things about doing DEIB work is understanding the lived experiences of other folks. And that's where you get a lot of the education, or at least that's where I got a lot of my education about so many of the other identities and the other sort of traits that people sort of bring into their work and into their communities, right? I'd say that that's the first thing that I would think about. And the second thing that I would do is really start digging into a lot of the history. There's so much material that is out there around DEIB that, a quick Google search, just like you might be looking for a solution to your programming question, you can also probably find some really great references for, the DEIB work or the kinds of questions that you're thinking about that when you want to start getting involved here. And this isn't directly related to your question, but I think that there's also a lot that folks who are really involved in DEIB work that can make it easier for people, or to create a lot more progress for folks that are thinking about getting involved here, is to create a really safe environment for people to learn, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, and continue developing a relationship, right? I think that a lot of people who are first sort of stepping into doing DEIB work have a lot of fear that they might make a mistake or say the wrong thing or do something else like that, right? And I think it's the responsibility, the shared responsibility of everybody, including and probably especially the folks that are thinking about, how to foster a really inclusive community, to make sure that, people feel safe to sort of have these conversations and probably make mistakes. No one comes into this knowing everything about DEIB, right? Everybody starts somewhere. And it's probably almost inevitably the case that someone's going to make a mistake. I know I certainly have. And so the only way that I think that we're going to move forward on these fronts is by making sure that one, yes, we provide the resources, and two, we develop the relationships too, but also to make sure that we have an environment where everybody is learning on this journey together, right? And I think we all have a part to play in making sure that that's the case.